What's up, y'all? I figured I'd use this time to talk about the accomplishments of Black and brown folk in the music industry. As we all know, music has always been a form of expression through the medium of art. But did you know that many marginalized communities throughout the course of history have expressed their frustration and anger to push the boundaries of a lot of these genres? And in addition to that, did you know that over generations, cultural traditions that had music deeply embedded within them often mixed together throughout the course of history to create newer genres of music and push those boundaries as well? Take a look at this picture over here. You'll notice that in almost every genre imaginable, African American music has been behind it. Let's take a look at a few of them, shall we? So let's start off with blues. Blues is known as something that's dynamic and diverse, following no real strict doctrine and using readily available instruments, sometimes even ones made at home. And this was perfect because it made blues easily accessible to all people, regardless of their socioeconomic status or their race. And at the time when Black people weren't really given these same opportunities as other people, such as we saw in the Jim Crow era, and so they created their own type of music, which was diverse. And on top of that, it dictated lots of genres that were to come after this. Let's jump into a different type of genre, one that we don't often associate with Black culture: rock and roll. Although many people often consider rock and roll as something that's more of a white genre, many of its origins actually stem from African American culture. See, rock and roll was largely tied to the migration of a lot of African Americans due to the collective war effort that was going on during that time. And rock and roll is actually directly evolved from the rhythm and blues genre that preceded it in the 1940s and the 1950s, which obviously is known as R&B today. However, at the time, there was a lot of controversy. There were times when Black Americans made amazing rock and roll songs, but they wouldn't get plays. So oftentimes, record labels would do something that was, well, at the time it wasn't racist, but we all know. They actually enlisted some white bands to cover these songs, which in turn would get more record plays. So we can actually see this here in this example. Listen to each one and look at the band names and let me know what you think.
Life could be a dream, life could be a dream. Do, 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 shaboom. Life could be a dream. If I could take you up in paradise up above. If you would tell me I'm the
only one that you love. Life could be a dream, sweetheart. Hello, hello again. Shaboom, and hoping we'll meet again. Oh, life could be a dream. If only all my precious plans would come true. If you would let me spend my whole...
And to top this off, members of the Black community were actually at the forefront of this genre, as we see here with the grandmother of rock and roll, Rosetta Thorpe. Let's get into... You like jazz? Wait, is that... How do they say it? Yellow. All right, so let's jump into jazz. So jazz is known for its varying styles, and this is often due to its experimentation and the improvisation that actually went into discovering all these subgenres of jazz. This was born from a fusion of musical styles from New Orleans, where African Americans, white Europeans, and French-speaking Creoles actually coexisted. Segregation actually brought more incentive for dark-skinned Creoles to associate with English-speaking African Americans, resulting in the mixing of their musical traditions. And soon after, jazz was actually brought on by Black workers to riverboats, to places like Missouri and Kansas, and took off the nightclubs of southern Chicago. I mean, what's a really good example of this that a lot of people would know? Princess and the Frog, right? This one's gonna be interesting. Let's jump into disco. So I'm not actually going to go into the history of disco. Instead, I'm going to talk about a moment in disco's history. So disco pretty much fell out of fashion pretty much overnight in 1979, and this was largely in part to anti-disco movements that were going through the country. Yeah, you heard me right, anti-disco movements. But wait, there's actually a reason behind that. So a lot of these movements actually held these things called anti-disco rallies, and one of the most extreme and infamous of these rallies was this night called Disco Demolition.
Disco sucks! Disco sucks! Disco sucks!
This was actually headed by this angered DJ who had lost his job due to the growing popularity of disco music. And so what he wanted to do was, after the baseball game that played that night, he pretty much drove into the field after the baseball game was over, threw a bunch of disco records into the middle of the playing field, and then blew them up with dynamite. Yeah, dynamite.
Back in the ballpark, and I'm sure glad, and I hope they don't let you people see what's going on here at Comiskey Park. One of the saddest sights I've ever seen in a ballpark in my life. This garbage of demolishing a record has turned into a fiasco.
See, the connection here is that disco was played by a lot of people in the black and brown communities and other communities as well, such as the LGBT community. After this event, it triggered a nationwide sentiment against disco, and oftentimes express racism and homophobia. Ooh, I think y'all will like this one. House music. Deep inside, deep down inside, I feel it. See, I know this has been covered recently, especially in places like Insomniac and, other EDM channels, but let's just jump into it. So other people who haven't heard it will get a chance to hear this stuff. So what's known now as one of the largest genres of EDM, house music, actually started in the late 1970s in the underground clubs of Chicago, Detroit, and New York. See, club culture actually was super popular during the disco era. And at the same time, the DJs that were playing this actually experimented with a bunch of different genres and mixing styles. The exact origins of the name house is sort of unclear, but what we can assume was that it started from this place called the Warehouse in Chicago, led by this DJ named Frankie Knuckles, who is often coined as the godfather of house music, where he would spin and mix lots of tracks together and create music that would keep people dancing for hours. Places like the Warehouse were predominantly filled with people from the LGBT community, as well as the African American community and the Latino community. And these communities were the main reason why the popularity of house music skyrocketed.
The music is just a reflection of the culture. It's a microcosm of what's actually happening out in the world. People started to ask for their voices to be heard. The women's movement, the gay movement, Black Power movement, all these things started to cross-pollinate each other, and we became comrades. And it played itself out in nightclubs.
Clubs such as the Warehouse were often safe spaces for people from these communities who wanted to escape social issues and enjoy sort of a euphoric experience away from what was known at the time as public scrutiny. This one's really awesome. Ever heard of reggaeton? In the 1970s, Jamaicans formed what would be known today as reggae, and they began playing classic reggae songs outside with loudspeakers, which later became known as dance halls. And on top of that, it further birthed the dancehall genre. And so dancehall actually made its way all the way to Latin America, where Puerto Ricans actually took it upon themselves and started playing around with it. And then once they went to America and came back, they brought with them hip hop and trap, resulting in the mix of these genres, which became known as reggaeton.
Puerto Ricans in the late 80s and early 90s began migrating to New York, more specifically, the Bronx. It was there that they were firsthand witnesses to the emergence of a new radical form of music that we all call hip hop. Hip hop's influence made its way back to Puerto Rico and began to influence the underground movement there. It infused itself with reggae and Espanol and thus created what we now know as reggaeton.
Reggaeton actually has a lot of background to it in the political space.
Reggaeton and hip hop were both associated with the obscene or violent. They were both scrutinized by authoritative figures and blamed for social disorder. But both were merely a reaction to social injustices associated with race and economic status. The underground music of reggaeton was an outlet for social frustration in Puerto Rico, and despite the government-funded programs that were aimed to ban the music and shut it down, it still resonated with the youth and became more and more popular as time passed. At a time where most clubs would not even play a single reggaeton song, disc jockeys like DJ Negro formed their own collectives and played the music exclusively. Thanks to him and other Puerto Rican DJs, the genre continued to grow and eventually made its way back to the United States and into Europe.
So we looked at a bunch of different genres, and there's sort of an underlying theme that runs across all of it. In all of these genres, they were used as a form of expression, and oftentimes authoritative figures actually took this as a threat, especially white authority. And so they shut it down, which led to more reactions. You get the point here. Lots of music has been tied to these communities, and for a larger reason than you or I are led to believe. So with that being said, how can we support these cultures that birthed and led to all of these genres? Well, we can be allies to them. We see that a lot of people place influence on music such as reggaeton, funk, and all of these different things, but more often than not, it comes off as more appropriation as opposed to appreciation of the culture. So here are a few of the allies that I think you should take a look at. Selection is a really big one of them, and no, this is not sponsored. Selection is actually a collective of DJs all over the world, and they play music from all different genres, from reggaeton to jazz to house to Afro beats, all of these different genres. We also have people such as Chad Hugo. In case you didn't know, he's one half of the Neptunes. And the reason why I list Chad Hugo as an ally, who's actually Filipino, he doesn't come from these different communities, creates the music and just sort of appreciates the culture from the side. In addition to that, we have people like Alice in Wonderland, who's been outspoken for these underrepresented communities. In addition to that, we have people like Beat Rock Music, which Bamboo, one of the lead rappers in this collective, actually spoke out about Rich Brian's rise to fame and how it actually took advantage of hip-hop culture. So what did we learn today? We learned that lots of music has been tied to different political movements throughout history, and Black and brown cultures have been at the forefront of this. And so before you listen to your next song, you might want to take a second to listen and appreciate all of the history that's embedded within this music to deliver the sound as it is today to your ears. Thanks.